In the spring of 1978, Marvin Webster stood 4 victories from basketball immortality. Over 22 playoff games, the 7'1" center raised his scoring, rebounding, and shot blocking while helping carry the Seattle SuperSonics all the way to the NBA Finals. At last, the player chosen in the first round by 2 rival leagues had become exactly what everyone once believed he could be: the defensive center of a championship contender. Then, he left. Webster signed with the New York Knicks, and under the compensation rules of that era, Seattle received Lonnie Shelton and a first-round draft pick. 1 year later, the SuperSonics finished the climb and won the NBA championship without him. Webster never returned to the finals. The greatest season of his professional life had helped place Seattle at the door, but the pieces connected to his departure helped the franchise walk through it. That is the scar running through the rest of his basketball life. A man called the Human Eraser made one enormous bet on New York, and the trophy traveled in the opposite direction. His own career began to fade, while the team he had left celebrated the championship he had spent years chasing. 3 decades later, on the 4th of April, 2009, hotel staff in Tulsa, Oklahoma, found the former star unresponsive. Webster had passed away at 56, only 9 days before his next birthday. By then, the Sports Illustrated cover, the finals run, and the records at Morgan State belonged to another era. But the road between Seattle and that Tulsa hotel room was not a simple fall. It was a life shaped by historic dominance, recurring illness, one costly choice, a determined comeback, and a family loss far larger than basketball. To understand why 2 leagues once fought over Marvin Webster and why one season in Seattle still defines him, the story has to begin in Baltimore with a preacher's son whose reach would soon change every shot taken near him. Marvin Nathaniel Webster was born on the 13th of April, 1952, in Baltimore, Maryland, the son of a preacher. His route to national attention stayed close to home at first: Edmondson High School, then Morgan State University, only a few miles from where his life had begun. By adulthood, Webster stood 7 feet and 1 inch tall. Height alone can attract scouts, but it cannot produce the numbers he would soon compile. The distinction was in how he used that frame, recovering across the lane, meeting shots at their highest point, controlling rebounds in traffic, and staying active enough to influence possession after possession rather than waiting beneath the basket. At Edmondson High School, that combination began to take recognizable form. Morgan State did not receive a finished professional center. It received a young Baltimore player whose size, timing, and endurance could be developed together. The choice also kept him close to the city and community that knew him before national attention arrived. That matters because Webster's college legacy was built locally before it became national. He was not introduced to the country through a major conference television machine. He earned attention from a historically black university competing in Division II, where extraordinary performances could still occur outside the brightest national spotlight. When Webster walked onto the court at Morgan State, opponents discovered that his height was only the beginning. His ability to close space at the rim gave him a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life. Marvin Webster arrived at Morgan State University and became a 4-year letterman, playing from 1971 through 1975. And it was there, in the green and blue of the Morgan State Bears, that the legend truly began. It happened during his junior year. By the season of 1973 and 74, Webster was doing something at the rim that defied belief. He was averaging 8 blocked shots per game. 8. Not for a single hot night, not for a stretch of lucky games, but as a regular, expected part of what he brought to the floor. Drive into the lane against Marvin Webster, and there was a very real chance your shot was coming right back at you. The number becomes easier to understand when you imagine what his reach did to an ordinary possession. A guard could beat the first defender and believe the difficult work was finished, only to find Webster crossing the lane with one long step. He did not have to swat every attempt into the seats. Sometimes the threat changed the shot before it left the shooter's hand. A higher release, a rushed angle, a pass thrown back toward the perimeter, a pass thrown back toward the perimeter. Then Webster turned, found a body, and used those same arms to finish the possession with a rebound. The block was the visible event. The hesitation around him was the larger defensive achievement. That is when the nickname was born, the human eraser. Because watching him defend was like watching someone wipe a chalkboard clean. The shot went up, and then in an instant, it was gone, erased, as if the attempt had never happened at all. But here is what people forget. He was not just a shot blocker. In that same season of 1973 and 74, Webster averaged 21 points and 22 4/10 rebounds per game. 21 and 22. That is a dominant two-way force, a man controlling both ends of the floor. For that performance, he was named Division II Player of the Year. And that raises one of the central aching themes of his entire story. This was Division II basketball, not the brightest stage college sports had to offer. Yet here was a giant, putting up numbers that should have made him a household name across every level of the game. He was, in a sense, too big for the room he was playing in, a feared talent in a quieter corner of basketball, the first hint of a career that always seemed to deserve more attention than it got. The nickname made him memorable. His production helped earn Morgan State a championship, and his rebounding and shot blocking placed him in record books that would preserve far more than a promotional label ever could. In 1974, Marvin Webster led the Morgan State Bears to the NCAA Division II championship. This was the peak of his college life, the moment a regional star became a national name. A title is a title, and a giant who could score, rebound, and erase shots at the rim while lifting his team to a championship was impossible to ignore any longer. But the games end, and the records remain. And the records Marvin Webster left behind at Morgan State were the kind that make you stop and read them twice. At the time of his passing, Webster held 8 career school records at Morgan State. Among them were 2,267 career rebounds and 722 career blocks. Those are not just good numbers for a college big man. Those are the numbers of a man who reshaped what his program thought was possible. And the story reached beyond his own school. For years after his career ended, his rebounding totals stood near the very top of the national record books. His 740 rebounds in the single season of 1974, along with his career total of 2,267, ranked second all-time in NCAA history in their respective categories, a standing that held for a long stretch of years after he last laced up for the Bears. Let that settle in. Second all-time in NCAA history, not second in Division II. Second across the entire landscape of college basketball rebounding for years and years after he was finished. The human eraser was not just a nickname for highlight reels. It was a description backed by some of the most staggering numbers the college game has ever recorded. This is the cruel beauty of the Marvin Webster story. The young man from a Baltimore church, the giant from a Division II school, walked away from college with a legacy carved deep enough to outlast him. His talent was so rare that in 1975, two rival professional leagues both fought to draft him in the first round, a double honor almost no one in basketball history ever received. The level of competition is sometimes used to shrink achievements after the fact, but Webster's draft position makes that argument difficult to sustain. Professional evaluators from both leagues saw the same player, studied the same smaller school resume, and reached nearly identical conclusions about his value. Atlanta considered him worthy of the third selection in the NBA draft. Denver used the first ABA selection on him. Whatever distance existed between Morgan State and the largest college stage, it had not hidden his ability from the people deciding where professional franchises would invest their futures. There is also a broader significance in where that resume was built. Morgan State gave a Baltimore player a platform close to home, and Webster returned the investment by helping deliver a national championship. His records belong not only to an individual career, but to the history of a program that proved elite basketball could be developed outside the familiar national powers. The professional leagues did not discover him from nowhere in 1975. Morgan State had already prepared and displayed him for 4 seasons. In 1975, Marvin Webster found himself at the center of a tug-of-war between 2 professional basketball leagues. He was selected in the first round of the NBA draft, taken 3rd overall by the Atlanta Hawks. And he was selected in the first round of the ABA draft, taken 1st overall by the Denver Nuggets. 2 leagues, 2 first-round selections, 1 giant from Morgan State at the heart of it all. To understand why this mattered so much, you have to understand the moment. The mid-1970s were the final, frantic years of the war between the established NBA and the upstart ABA, that bold, colorful league with the red, white, and blue ball and the wide-open style. By 1975, the 2 leagues were locked in a financial battle for survival and for talent. This was, in fact, the ABA's final season, though no one could say for certain how it would all end. Both leagues were desperate for stars, and both were willing to fight for the best young big men in the country. And so, a 7'1" shot blocker who had just been named Division II Player of the Year, a man who could erase shots and grab rebounds by the truckload, was exactly the kind of prize both sides wanted. Being chosen 3rd overall in one league and 1st overall in the other tells you everything about how the basketball world saw him at that moment. He was not a project. He was not a gamble. He was a wanted man. In the end, Webster made his choice. He signed with the Denver Nuggets and cast his lot with the ABA, joining a league living out its final chapter. It is worth noting that the records from those last ABA days were never documented as thoroughly as the NBA's, so some details from that era come down to us with a little less certainty than we would like. But the decision itself was clear enough. The preacher's son from Baltimore was about to begin his professional career in the mile-high city. He chose Denver. Within months, however, a medical diagnosis interrupted the beginning that both Webster and the Nuggets had expected. Marvin Webster arrived in Denver as a wanted man, a giant fresh off a championship and a national reputation, ready to prove that all the hype was earned. And then, almost before it began, something went wrong. Shortly after signing with the Nuggets, Webster was diagnosed with a form of hepatitis. For a professional athlete, this was a quiet kind of disaster. There was no broken bone you could point to, no torn ligament with a clean timeline for recovery. This was an illness deep in the body, draining his strength, sapping the energy a 7'1" man needs to battle in the paint night after night. And it cost him dearly. In his rookie season of 1975 and 76, Marvin Webster played in only 38 games. After 2 leagues treated him as a franchise prize, his first professional season became an incomplete introduction. The talent had not disappeared. The opportunity to display it had, and he had lost the one thing a rookie can never fully recover: an uninterrupted first impression. That kind of beginning can attach a question mark to any young player. Webster returned to a Denver team built to win and accepted a role behind Dan Issel. The featured star expectations of draft day had not vanished, but for the moment they gave way to a simpler test: stay on the floor and earn his place. The season of 1976 and 77 was the year Marvin Webster got back on his feet. After a rookie campaign stolen by illness, he answered with something basketball players treasure above almost everything else. He answered with availability. He appeared in 80 games for the Denver Nuggets that season, a full and demanding schedule, proof that the body could hold up when it was finally given the chance. But he did not return as the centerpiece. He returned as a backup, playing behind Dan Issel, one of the most reliable and respected scorers the game had to offer in those years. And there was a story buried in that role. Here was a man who had been a double first-round pick, a Division II Player of the Year, a giant who had erased shots by the handful in college. And now he was coming off the bench. For a player with his pride and his pedigree, that had to sting. That season became a quiet turning point. In a backup role behind Issel, Webster contributed to a Nuggets team that won the NBA Midwest Division after the merger. He had gone from missing most of his rookie year to surviving a full schedule inside a winning rotation. The question was no longer whether his body could carry him through a season. The question was whether another team would finally give him the responsibility his college career had promised. This was not new ground for him in Denver either. During his time with the Nuggets, the franchise had also reached the ABA Finals back in 1976, in those final days before the leagues came together. So in a relatively short span, Webster had been on the edge of championship-level basketball more than once. He was not yet a star in the professional ranks, but he was becoming something just as valuable. He was becoming a winner, a man who understood what it took to play deep into the spring. That experience would not stay buried on a bench for long. In the summer of 1977, a blockbuster trade sent him across the country to Seattle. And there, finally, he would step out of the shadows and into the only true peak season of his entire life. Before the 1977 and 78 season, the Denver Nuggets made a deal that would change the course of Marvin Webster's life. They sent Webster, along with veteran forward Paul Silas and Willie Wise, to the Seattle SuperSonics. In return, Denver received center Tom Burleson, guard Bobby Wilkerson, and a first-round draft pick. On paper, it was the kind of multiplayer trade that fills the sports pages for a day, and then fades. But for Webster, it was everything. Because for the first time in his professional career, he was not arriving as a question mark recovering from illness, and he was not arriving as a backup waiting his turn. He was arriving as a starter. The Seattle SuperSonics needed a center to anchor their defense, a long-armed presence to protect the rim, and Marvin Webster was exactly that man. And the timing could not have been better. Webster was stepping into a locker room that was about to become one of the most exciting young groups in basketball. Around him, a special team was taking shape. There was a rookie named Jack Sikma, a smart, skilled big man who would go on to a long and decorated career. There was Gus Williams, a lightning-quick guard who could take over a game with his scoring. And there was Dennis Johnson, a fierce competitor and defender who would later be remembered as one of the great winners of his generation. Picture the fit: a young, hungry, athletic roster, suddenly given a true defensive anchor in the middle. Webster brought everything those years in Denver had taught him. He brought the rim protection, the rebounding, and just as importantly, he brought the hard-earned knowledge of what winning basketball actually looked like. The role player who had stood patiently behind Dan Issel was now the foundation a rising contender could build around. The pieces were in place. The talent was real. And what happened next was the single greatest stretch of his career, a run that would carry the Seattle SuperSonics all the way to the NBA Finals. The 1977 and 78 season was the one Marvin Webster had been waiting his entire life to play. As the starting center for the Seattle SuperSonics, he put together a strong, dependable regular season. He averaged 14 points, 12 6/10 rebounds, and 2 blocks per game. Those are the numbers of a genuine starting center, a man holding down the middle for a serious team. But here is the part that made people lean forward. The regular season was only the warm-up. When the playoffs arrived and the pressure rose, Marvin Webster did not shrink. He grew. Across Seattle's 22-game playoff run, he lifted his game to another level entirely, averaging 16 1/10 points, 13 1/10 rebounds, and more than 2 6/10 blocks per contest. When the lights were brightest and every possession mattered, the big man got better. This was the moment all the promise finally arrived. The Division II phenom, the double first-round pick, the player whose rookie year was stolen by illness, was now standing at the center of a team marching through the Western Conference. The SuperSonics captured the Western Conference championship and reached the 1978 NBA Finals. For one shining stretch, Marvin Webster was not a what-if. He was a difference maker on one of the best teams in basketball, and the rebounding nights could be staggering. According to the NBA's official SuperSonics history, Webster once pulled down 21 rebounds in a single half of basketball, a franchise mark that speaks to just how relentless he could be on the glass when everything was working. 21 rebounds in one half. That is the kind of number that makes you stop and read it again, the kind of effort that defines a player at the absolute height of his powers. Seattle could feel his influence even when the ball never reached him. Dennis Johnson and Gus Williams pressured the perimeter, knowing a 7'1" center waited behind them. When a shot went up, Webster used his frame to hold position, reached above the traffic, and brought the ball down where smaller hands could not strip it. If an opponent challenged him at the rim, he recovered quickly enough to contest without surrendering the next rebound. The sequence repeated through 4 playoff rounds. Pressure outside, Webster protecting the inside, then the guards running once he had ended the possession. That was how a center could control the game without requiring the offense to stop for him. His value also depended on how the pieces around him fit. Jack Sikma could operate with skill and intelligence in the front court. Gus Williams supplied speed and scoring. Dennis Johnson brought pressure and toughness on the perimeter. Webster did not have to become the entire offense. He could protect the paint, finish possessions with rebounds, and give Seattle a dependable interior presence while the guards attacked. That balance helps explain why his regular season numbers rose in the playoffs rather than shrinking under a heavier workload. Over 22 postseason games, durability mattered as much as any single spectacular night. Webster had begun his professional career by missing much of a season through illness. In Seattle, he stayed on the floor through an extended playoff run and produced against changing opponents and higher stakes. The peak was short when measured in years, but it was not a brief hot streak. It lasted through an entire regular season and 4 demanding playoff rounds. This was Marvin Webster, as the basketball world had always imagined he could be. Dominant in the paint, fearsome at the rim, a central figure in a team chasing a title. After all the doubt, all the illness, all the patient waiting behind another man, he had finally claimed his moment. And then, in October of 1978, he stood on the cover of the most famous magazine in sports, at the exact moment he made the decision that would haunt 2 franchises for years to come. On the 16th of October, 1978, Marvin Webster appeared on the cover of Sports Illustrated. For an athlete of that era, there was no higher form of recognition. The magazine landed in mailboxes and on newsstands all across the country, and the season preview issue placed him at the very center of the basketball conversation. The giant from a Baltimore church, the Division II star who had been told he was too big for his room, was now the face the nation was looking at as a new season approached. This was the summit of his public life. Coming off a run to the NBA Finals, fresh off the best basketball he had ever played, Marvin Webster had finally arrived in full view of the entire sporting world. Everything he had fought for, through the illness and the waiting and the trades, had brought him to this single image of a rival. But around that same time, Webster made the decision that would shape the rest of his story. In 1978, he signed as a free agent with the New York Knicks. He left Seattle, the team where he had just become a star, and headed for the brightest, loudest stage in all of basketball. And this is where the questions begin. Why would a player walk away from a finals team at the very peak of his value? New York carried a pull all its own, the biggest market in the country, the bright lights of Madison Square Garden, the chance to be the centerpiece of one of the league's most storied franchises, rather than one piece among many on a rising team out west. For a man who had spent years being doubted and overlooked, the lure of New York, with all its attention and its promise, must have been powerful indeed. So he made his choice, just as he had chosen Denver years before. He bet on himself, on the big stage, on the idea that his peak in Seattle was only the beginning of something even greater. It was a gamble made by a man who had every reason to believe in his own ceiling. But that departure would do more than reshape his own career. It would hand Seattle the very pieces it needed to win a championship the very next year, without him. To understand what Marvin Webster's free agent move truly cost, you have to understand the strange rules of that era. In 1978, when a player signed with a new team, the league often required that team to compensate the club he left behind. It was not a simple matter of a player choosing his next stop. There was a price to be paid, and the league itself decided what that price would be. So when Webster headed for New York, Seattle did not walk away empty-handed. the compensation the NBA awarded was steep. Seattle received the playing rights to power forward Lonnie Shelton, a strong, physical young big man, along with the Knicks' first-round draft pick in 1979. Two valuable assets handed to the very team Webster had just helped carry to the finals. In the spring of 1979, the story played like a split screen. In Seattle, Shelton joined a deep physical rotation as the SuperSonics returned to the finals and completed the climb. The city celebrated its first NBA championship. Across the country, Webster was finishing a respectable first Knicks season, but respectability could not compete with confetti. The team he had left was holding the trophy, and part of the roster around it had arrived as the price of losing him. That is the cruel twist at the center of the story. The man known for erasing shots had, in a sense, erased himself from a championship he might have lifted. He gambled on New York, believing his greatest days were still ahead. The trophy went the other way. The line is powerful because the reality is more complicated than punishment for one choice. Webster had helped Seattle become good enough to reach the finals before he left. Had he stayed, Shelton and the draft pick would not have arrived. The rotation would have been different, and no one can guarantee the same result. Yet every Seattle victory made the comparison louder, while every difficult Knicks night made the move look more expensive. That is what timing can do to a reasonable decision. Had Seattle stalled, Webster's choice might have been remembered as an ambitious star moving toward a larger opportunity. Had he become the same playoff force in New York, the compensation would have been a footnote. Instead, the two paths separated almost immediately. One franchise reached the exact destination he wanted. The other became the place where his finest form slowly disappeared. The 1979 championship changed the meaning of everything that came before it. Webster was no longer simply the center who left Seattle. He became the missing man in the championship photograph, the player whose greatest run had ended 1 year too soon. From then on, each rebound in New York was measured against the spring when he had grabbed 13 a night under playoff pressure. And each season without a title reopened the same impossible question. What if he had stayed? In New York, he started strong enough. But after one solid season, the numbers began a quiet, relentless collapse that no one could fully explain. The first season in New York gave every reason for hope. In the campaign of 1978 and 79, Marvin Webster looked very much like the player the Knicks believed they were paying for. He averaged 11 3/10 points and 10 9/10 rebounds per game. That is a productive starting center, a double-double threat on most nights, a big man holding down the middle for one of the league's marquee franchises. Knicks fans had every reason to believe their gamble had paid off. Madison Square Garden magnified the promise. Webster arrived not as an anonymous project, but as the center from the Sports Illustrated cover, the man New York had paid for after watching him rise during the playoffs. Each blocked shot or hard rebound could be read as confirmation that Seattle had only revealed the beginning. The same spotlight also removed patience. A quiet night did not remain quiet in the largest market, and a gradual decline could not hide inside a rebuilding roster. New York had purchased the expectation of the Seattle version, and every appearance became an argument over whether that player had truly arrived. The move also placed him under a different kind of attention. Seattle had offered a rising team with clearly divided responsibilities. New York offered a larger market and the expectations attached to a major free agent signing. The compensation awarded to Seattle ensured that the transaction would be judged from both directions, by what Webster produced for the Knicks and by what Shelton and the draft asset contributed to the team he had left. Every season afterward made that comparison harder for New York and more favorable to Seattle. The first Knicks season established a clear benchmark, but Webster never reached it again. After 1978 and 79, he did not average double figures in either points or rebounds in another NBA season. There was no single dramatic night when the Seattle version of him disappeared. His minutes narrowed, his production declined, and year by year, the center who had just dominated a playoff run became harder to find in the numbers. Hepatitis would eventually return, but it cannot explain every season in between. That is what makes the New York decline so unsettling. Webster was still in his 20s, an age when many centers are entering their most productive years, and there was no one public event that accounted for the full change. Seattle had revealed his ceiling. New York became a long record of how quickly that ceiling moved out of reach. There was no single collapse for fans to point toward, no one collision or public rupture that divided the star from the player who followed. The change happened in increments: a smaller role, fewer rebounds, less scoring. Another season in which the Seattle peak looked farther away. That kind of decline can be harder to understand than a dramatic injury, because it leaves everyone waiting for a return that always appears possible and never quite arrives. For Webster, the waiting lasted years. The frame was still 7'1". The nickname still followed him into every arena. Opponents and fans could remember what those arms had done during the finals run, but memory does not restore minutes, and reputation does not return a body to its best season. By the time a second bout of hepatitis finally removed him from the floor completely, the great New York breakthrough had already become something the city had spent years expecting and never received. In the season of 1984 and 85, hepatitis struck Marvin Webster once again. This time, it did not merely cut his year in half, it took the whole thing. He missed the entire 1984 and 85 season, sidelined completely by the illness. And the damage did not stop there. The trouble carried into the following year as well, costing him the start of the 1985 and 86 season before he finally stepped away from the New York Knicks for good. The recurrence created a stark bookend without explaining everything that happened between. Hepatitis had limited Webster to 38 games as a rookie. Nearly a decade later, it removed a complete season and part of the next one. In both cases, the direct consequence was availability, the most basic requirement of a professional career. This time, the interruption came when his production had already diminished, and the path back to a major role had become much narrower. By the time he left the Knicks, the center who had once appeared on the cover of Sports Illustrated was no longer trying to reclaim a franchise role. He was trying to prove that he could still play at all. That effort would take him first to the Continental Basketball Association, and then, briefly, back to the NBA. But he was not finished. Not yet. He chased the game into the minor leagues and one last NBA city, refusing to let go. Some players walk away the moment the spotlight dims. Marvin Webster was not one of them. After his time with the New York Knicks ended, he did something that takes a quiet kind of courage. He kept playing, even as the stages grew smaller and the crowds grew thinner. In 1986, he turned up in the Continental Basketball Association, the rugged minor league where former NBA players, aging veterans, and young hopefuls all chased the same fading dream. He suited up for the Pensacola Tornadoes, a long way from Madison Square Garden, a long way from the finals, a long way from that magazine cover. For a man who had once been wanted by two professional leagues at the same time, the descent to the minor leagues was a humbling thing. But it also said something about who he was. He still loved the game. He was not ready to let it go. The game gave him one last call in the 1986-87 season. Webster appeared in 15 games for the Milwaukee Bucks, a final return to the league after Pensacola. There was no farewell tour and no announcement that each appearance might be the last. One day, the comeback simply ran out of games. The first overall ABA selection, the Seattle Finals center, and the Sports Illustrated cover subject left the NBA as a reserve, trying to hold one final place on a roster. Away from the court, Webster was married to Maderia Webster and was a father. Basketball also reached the next generation. His son, Marvin Webster Jr., earned a place at Temple University, carrying the family name into college basketball while beginning a path that belonged to him. Then, in August of 1997, that future ended without warning. The younger Webster suffered a heart attack and passed away before his sophomore season. Contemporary reports disagree on whether he was 18 or 19, so the cleanest truth is also the most painful. Marvin Webster lost his teenage son, a young player who had barely begun his own college life. The loss carried a particular echo because basketball had connected their names without making their paths identical. Marvin Jr. was not merely an extension of his father's resume. He was a young Temple player at the beginning of his own life, with seasons, choices, and relationships that had not yet had time to unfold. Public accounts preserve the roster connection and the abrupt ending. They cannot measure what it meant for a father who had already watched illness repeatedly interrupt his own career to see his son's future disappear before it could properly begin. No box score can tell us what the years after that loss felt like inside the family. What survived publicly was a much quieter image of the elder Webster. He lived in Metuchen, New Jersey, and was said to have worked in real estate. Harvey Ayrton of the New York Times later quoted a neighbor who rarely saw him and described him as a man who generally kept to himself. The giant who had once occupied the center of an NBA Finals had become almost invisible in his own building. But quiet did not mean empty. Webster's former agent and later financial advisor remembered another side of him, an avid reader, a deeply religious man, and someone who enjoyed traveling. Those details matter because they return a person to a story that can otherwise become nothing but illness, missed championships, and loss. Webster's life away from basketball was private, not non-existent. They also explain why Tulsa was not as mysterious as it first appeared. Bennett said Webster had sought alternative treatment in Oklahoma for a toxic imbalance connected to hepatitis. Webster liked the area and returned repeatedly, spending much of his final year there. The city where his life ended was not simply a random dot on a map. It had become part of his continuing attempt to manage the illness that had first interrupted his career more than 3 decades earlier. In early April of 2009, hotel employees became concerned after not seeing him for several days. Webster was found unresponsive in his room. Authorities said there was no indication of foul play, while Bennett said the passing was related to coronary artery disease. Webster was 56, 9 days short of his next birthday. The scene does not need artificial darkness to carry weight. There was a hotel corridor, a guest whose absence had become noticeable, and employees performing the ordinary duty of checking a room. No crowd waited outside, no scoreboard recorded the moment, and no camera connected the man inside to the center who had once controlled an NBA Finals. The quiet is striking precisely because his earlier life had been measured in public noise, blocked shots, rebounds, magazine covers, and thousands of people reacting at once. Tulsa reduced all of that distance to one private room. Yet it should not be presented as a mysterious final hiding place. Webster had returned to Oklahoma repeatedly while seeking help for a long-running health problem. The location was quiet, but it was connected to a purpose. There is still a stark distance between the scene in Tulsa and the arenas of his prime. But now that distance carries more than loneliness. He had returned to Oklahoma seeking help for an old physical problem. The same recurring illness that had disrupted his rookie year and later removed a full season was still shaping his movements long after basketball had ended. The final trip was connected, in a quiet and deeply human way, to the struggle that had followed him from the beginning. Long before Tulsa, the proof of Marvin Webster had been written at Morgan State. 21 points, 22 4/10 rebounds, and 8 blocked shots per game during a championship season. His 740 rebounds that year, 2,267 for his college career, and 722 blocks placed a Division II center beside the most productive players anywhere in college basketball. His later selection to the Division II All-Elite 8 team confirmed that the run belonged to tournament history, not merely school memory. Seattle finally translated that college promise into a complete professional season. Webster held the middle for a finals team, improved under playoff pressure, and produced a half with 21 rebounds. The Sports Illustrated cover and New York offer arrived when his value had never been higher. At 26, he was not fleeing failure. He was betting that his greatest season had opened a door rather than marked the ceiling. Hindsight made the bet look reckless because Seattle reached the destination first. But no alternate version can be proved. Keeping Webster would have changed the roster, the compensation, and every decision that followed. The question survives because he had already taken the team within one series of the trophy. The possibility was real enough to hurt. New York never supplied an equal reward. A productive first season gave way to shrinking numbers, the eventual return of hepatitis, Pensacola, and 15 final games in Milwaukee. Even then, Webster kept trying after the role became smaller than the reputation. What followed survives only in fragments. His marriage to Madeira, a son beginning his own path at Temple, the sudden loss of that teenage son, quiet years in New Jersey, and repeated visits to Oklahoma for help with an illness that had never fully left the story. The pieces do not create a neat final act. Lives rarely do once the cameras leave. Marvin Webster lived only to 56. That fact gives the story sorrow, but it should not be allowed to steal the story's meaning. His life was not important because it ended quietly. It was important because of what came before: the championship in Baltimore, the record book at Morgan State, the battle between two leagues for his signature, and the spring when he became one of the best centers left standing in professional basketball. He was not merely a forgotten player in a Tulsa hotel room. He was the human eraser, a Morgan State champion, a record-setting rebounder, a finals center. And for one unforgettable season in Seattle, Marvin Webster showed exactly why two leagues had once fought for the right to build around him. Then he made one choice. The championship arrived without him, and the rest of his career was spent trying to reach a height he had already touched. That is the part that stays with you. Not simply that Marvin Webster was overlooked or injured or gone too soon. It is that he came close enough to the summit to see it clearly and watched someone else raise the trophy from the path his own departure helped create.